lecture will be November the 6th. Dr. Sabra Weber. Dr. Weber, are you here right now? I don't see. Okay. She is in the Department of Comparative Studies and will talk on, quote, spectacular descent. Colin Kaepernick takes a knee, unquote. So that's interesting. I looked up what that might be about just for your own interests. And this is what I got. Folkloristics, anthropological linguistics, and performance studies have much to contribute to aesthetic studies of sport, athletes, and human rights, using theoretical and methodological tools to provide insight into what specific complex of text and context conspire to empower one small, silent folk tableau's international engagement. So that sounds really interesting, doesn't it? That's next month here, right? So it's still football season, so that should work. One last announcement. There was a party here last night, and left over are free pumpkins in boxes on the rear patio. You may take them home for free. So just walk out, grab one, and take it home with you. Nice little benefit today. So our talk today is being given by Dr. Paul Beck, who graduated in 1971 with his PhD from the University of Michigan. He's currently Professor Emeritus and Academy Professor of Political Science at OSU and the International Coordinator of the Comparative National Elections Project, which now includes almost 70 national election surveys conducted since 1990 in 31 different countries. He's been the primary investigator of dozens of public opinion polls during his career. Most recently, he co-directed multiple surveys of voters for Britain and France in their 2017 elections, for the US in its 2020 election, for Ohio in its 2022 primary, and for Brazil in its 2022 election. Over the course of his career, Dr. Beck has published 9 books and numerous articles in leading professional journals on voting behavior, political parties, and public opinion. He's received 5 research grants from the National Science Foundation, has been a regular commentator on politics in the media and before community and professional groups. He served as the political science department chair for 19 years at 2 different universities, 13 of them at Ohio State, and as dean of social and behavioral sciences at Ohio State. And he's here to talk to us a little bit about his career, but also about this election, I think. Dr. Beck?
Thank you, Mark. Can everybody hear me well enough? Okay, good, very good. Well, I'm glad to be here. Glad to see so many familiar faces, actually. I wanted to start out not talking about the 2024 election, mainly because I'm tired of talking about it, and you may be tired of hearing about it, but rather to talk about sort of the 2 hats that I have worn, particularly since I have retired. One is a research hat, and that has to do with what Mark described as the Comparative National Election Project. We've conducted multiple surveys around the world. We are scheduled to do a survey of the American electorate after the 2024 election. I'm doing that in conjunction with 2 colleagues here, Dick Gunther and Chip Evelyn, and with a colleague, former colleague in Ohio State, but also now at Northwestern, Eric Nesbitt. So it's been a really fulfilling set of research activities. And my own focus on that research has been on political polarization, that I will talk a little bit about today. By the way, the United States is the most polarized country of all the ones that we've studied, except for Mozambique, when we did a survey right after their civil war. And you could understand polarization in that particular environment. But I've done work on political polarization. I've been very interested in how discussion networks tie into political polarization, how we kind of protect ourselves from dissent. And that's true cross-nationally, but especially in the United States. And I've also been interested in party contacting, the extent to which political parties contact voters, trying to encourage them or mobilize them to vote in elections. But the other hat that I've worn is the one that really focuses on what I'm going to do today. And that is because elections have been a specialty of mine since I began my career many years ago. I talk about elections. I give presentations like the one today. I think I'm up to 21 for 2024, which is probably more than I should be giving, but it is. I am verging on 100 different media interviews. It seems like people in the media, reporters, want to hear what I have to say, mostly because they're looking for juicy quotes that they can put in their stories. And I've learned over time not to provide juicy quotes because I don't want to be quoted in such a way that it kind of distorts what my meaning has been. This, by the way, is, I think, a particularly propitious time to give a talk on the 2024 election. Early voting has already started in a total of 8 states. Started last week in 6 of them. It starts in Ohio on October the 8th. So we really are into the voting season right now. And it will last in Ohio for another month or so. By the point that we've gotten so sick and tired of seeing ads on television, even at Ohio State football games, if you can imagine that, that's almost sacrilegious. I had a colleague, by the way, who was in Massachusetts and came to visit us here in Ohio back in, I think it was 2016. And he said, "Oh, I'm so glad to be here in Ohio because we don't get any ads in Massachusetts. It's a safe state. Nobody spends money to advertise there." And then after 3 days here, as I'm taking him to the airport, he said, "I am so glad to be going back to Massachusetts." So I'm sick and tired of seeing the same negative ads over and over and over again. And so I haven't heard from him since then, so he may be quite content to stay in Massachusetts. Okay, well, let me start, and I want to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to talk about by focusing basically on a broader context for the 2024 election. And I'll make these points and then I'll show you some figures that demonstrate what I'm talking about. One is that Americans are equally divided between Democrats and Republicans. And I mean almost equally divided. Secondly is that partisans, Democrats and Republicans, are deeply polarized in a variety of ways about their attitudes towards the parties and the party's candidates. I'm going to talk about feeling thermometers, which is a way that we use to measure how people feel about candidates, but there are other ways of doing it and they show the same thing. The result is, as we have seen, a tightly contested election in 2024 and before, with only modest changes during the campaign. If you do like I do, because I have to, I'm giving talks on this or interviews, if you do like I do and pay attention to the polls, you'll find that they hardly change from day to day. And you would think they would. There are some dramatic things that occur during the campaigns, and they nudge the figures by 1 or 2%, but maybe that's all. And I think that will hold true probably for the rest of the campaign season, all the way up to election day. The third and fourth points that I want to make, and I don't have figures to demonstrate this. One is that there will be also, as there was in 2020 and even 2016, a really spirited contestation of the electoral process before and after the election. It'll be focused on voter eligibility, who should be eligible to vote, be focused on the ballot counts, who does the counts, and who certifies them. And then it'll be focused on statewide certification of results. We saw that in 2020 all the way up to what, January 6th. And I don't expect us to go, well, no, I shouldn't say that. We may go that far again this year, but it's going to be hotly contested and hotly contested, particularly by a certain presidential candidate if he loses. And we'll have to see how that unfolds. And then the other thing that we've had, and this has gone on, by the way, for years, and that is foreign interference with American elections, basically to sow chaos, to make Americans think twice about whether democracy is a good thing and democratic elections are a good thing. Even some of this foreign interference favors particular candidates. They line up on both sides, by the way. The Iranians seem to be fearful that Trump will be elected as president. They haven't, I don't think, uh, tried to influence people to vote for Harris, but they certainly are trying to influence people to vote against Trump. On the other side, the Russians, the Chinese to some degree, are very much focused on trying to elect Donald Trump. And what's been, I think, particularly problematic about this is that some members of Congress have picked up these themes in their own advertisements and their own talk about the elections. And they've given legitimacy to these attempts at foreign interference to the extent to which other members of Congress have basically criticized and attacked them for operating in the service of some hostile foreign country. So there's an incredible mix of things going on in 2024. The election itself, of course, is a heady mix of things, but if you add to it these attempts at interference and these attempts to question and challenge the very electoral process itself, you get a very complicated kind of picture. I'm not going to make any predictions today, and the reason is because I really don't know. I don't have any confidence in whatever prediction I would make. I think the election right now is too close to call, both in terms of the popular vote, but even more so in terms of the Electoral College vote. Whether that changes between now and November the 5th, I'm actually doubtful. But it could. There could be some dramatic event that would occur in the meantime. Okay. Let me show you some of the backdrop to what I was talking about initially. One is that Americans are deeply and almost equally divided in terms of their partisanship. Surveys ask the question, and the most famous one is, generally speaking, do you think of yourself as a Democrat or a Republican or what? And people can specify the what. You know, they may be libertarians, they may be independents, and so forth. As you will see from this particular figure, there are very few people who aren't willing to specify that they're Democrats or Republicans. Some of them weakly so, some of them very strongly. And what's important to know about this is that people who are strong identifiers, particularly, are people who are almost tribal in their loyalties. They are people who vote overwhelmingly for the candidates of their party, whoever those candidates may be. They're people who are much more likely to turn out in elections. And they're people who engage in what psychologists refer to as motivated reasoning. Their party comes first, and then they line up their way of thinking about the political world through that filter, through that screen of party. And that's why issues really don't seem to affect them very much, or why they can change their views on issues if their candidate, let's say for president, is adopting a particular position on an issue. So partisan motivated reasoning, you need to bear in mind, we all engage in it. Some of us engage in it probably much more than others. If you've tried to argue with a friend who has a different partisan attachment than yours, you'll understand how capable they are at protecting themselves from any kind of challenge to what they're thinking. And you probably at that point would just give up and not even want to talk to them about politics. Years ago, by the way, when I was back teaching, I had a Wednesday evening or late afternoon class, and I recognized, this was before Thanksgiving, that most of the students would want to be home celebrating Thanksgiving with their relatives and families. And so I said to them, in my benevolence, I'm going to cancel the Wednesday class, but on the condition that at the Thanksgiving dinner table, you discuss partisan politics with people who are there. And I looked out at this group in the classroom and I could see people just thinking, oh my God, I don't want to do that. Uncle John is going to be there and I don't want to set him off. Or Aunt Jane, I don't want to set her off. And then that Monday when we met again and they had come back from Thanksgiving break, I said, well, okay, how many of you had discussed politics at the Thanksgiving dinner table? Not a hand went up. And I certainly understand that because I didn't do it either. Okay, well, let me go back here for just a minute. I wanted to give credit to the Pew Research Center. There are a lot of measures of partisanship that are done in surveys. They do a particularly good job of that. But even more importantly, they had a figure that showed it from 1994 all the way to 2023. And what you can see there is that there's hardly any difference between the percentage of people who are Democrats and the percentage of people who are Republicans. And when you take into account that these are all survey samples, there is a range around those, the sampling error range or margin of error, that probably means that there's no difference between these. And so it's very tight. Democrats were a little bit behind in the beginning. They are a little bit ahead right now, but again, within the margin of error. So we're talking about parity there, equality between Democrats and Republicans. Secondly, let me talk about polarization. And as I said before, there are a lot of different ways to measure this. The one I really like to use is what's called a feeling thermometer. And this ranges from 0 degrees to 100 degrees. And then you can ask about anything. You can ask about leaders. You can ask about presidential candidates in the United States. You can ask about the political parties. You can ask about African Americans or religious conservatives or whatever. And what you're doing is asking people on this feeling thermometer to rate that particular group or individual. I like this because it travels well cross-nationally. We have surveys in Indonesia, we can ask it there. We have surveys in Latin America, we can ask it there. People seem to understand what we mean by this feeling thermometer, and they are quite willing to put people and groups on positions on this thermometer. If we do it over the telephone, it's kind of harder to do because it's hard for people to carry in their head a 0 to 100 scale. So we usually do it 0 to 10 there, but it translates pretty directly into this 0 to 100 scale. So anyway, what I've shown you here are Democrats and Republicans in terms of people who feel warmly towards the candidate of their party, 70 to 100 degrees on this scale, and people who feel coldly or negative to the candidate of the opposition party, or 0 to 30 degrees. What I should tell you, by the way, is that it matters what threshold you use. As we become more exacting, if you go down to 0 versus 20, or 0 to 20 versus 80 to 100, there are fewer people, of course, there. If you go down to 0 for their liking or their feelings about the candidate of the opposition party, to 100 for their feelings about the candidate of their own party, there are people there. There are people there in the United States. And in fact, there are a lot of them, a troubling number of people who are willing to just write off the candidate of the other party and give that candidate a very negative score, a 0 score in this case, or are so warm towards the candidate of their own party that they're willing to give that candidate 100 on the feeling thermometer. So here you can see that Republicans were more inclined to be polarized early on in this period. And as you get to more recent years, there's really no difference between Democrats and Republicans in terms of their feelings about here they are the presidential candidates. Again, there's sampling error here. And so when you see a difference of 2 or 3%, it really is no meaningful difference at all. It's within the margin of error. The source here, by the way, is the American National Election Studies. They've done these surveys asking about feeling thermometers all the way since I guess it was 64, probably. One of my colleagues here at Ohio State was a graduate student there, and he invented the feeling thermometer for their surveys. And so we have a really nice track record in each presidential election over time in terms of polarization. And the point that I want to make from this is that Americans also are deeply polarized. And in fact, if I were to break this down into Democrats versus Republicans, and it's almost that if you think about what's underlying this, if you break it down into Democrats versus Republicans, both Democrats and Republicans are deeply polarized themselves. They like their side, they dislike the other side. That's true whether it is the political party itself or the candidates for president or the candidates for vice president, for that matter. Very, very powerful polarization. Okay, let me start out by talking about the presidential contest. And as all of you know, it is now a Harris versus Trump contest. A big change occurred once Biden decided to drop out, and Harris was anointed in effect by Biden and by the Democratic delegates as the candidate. There are other candidates who are also running for president. Kennedy on some ballots, although I'm told not on the Ohio ballot. Jill Stein of the Green Party, and I think she is not on the Ohio ballot either, though I've not received a ballot, so I don't really know. Cornel West as an independent, Oliver as the Libertarian candidate, who in Ohio always has, the party does, always has a ballot line for president. The presidential winner is not the person, of course, who receives the most popular votes. It's the person who wins enough, a majority of the Electoral College votes. And right now, that depends on the results in 7 different states, but only 7 different states. And I've enumerated them there: Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Not Ohio. We were once there, but no longer. We now are a pretty safe safe state for Republican candidates for president and for other offices as well. And so pay attention to these swing states. Who carries them? Which presidential candidate wins them? Even if that candidate doesn't win a majority of their votes, they can win just a plurality, which means less than 50%. They get, in all states but 2, all of the electoral votes of that state. If there is a tie, and there now is some talk about, well, what would happen if there is a tie, and that may depend upon a single congressional district in Omaha, district that has gone Democratic in recent years, and that could be the district that puts the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris over the top. But that is almost too much speculation for this time of the year. If no candidate receives a majority of the Electoral College vote, if there's a tie, in other words, the election is decided in the House of Representatives, with each state delegation having 1 vote. And right now, it would be a Republican majority there, and so the House, unless it changes, would be electing a Republican president. I wanted to very, very quickly talk about some key events during what's been a tumultuous 2024 presidential campaign. On June 20th through the 25th, the polls were showing that Trump was ahead by about 4 points. It depended on the poll. Some were a little more, some were a little less than that, and that he was in the lead in the swing states. And then on June 27th, there was the debate between Biden and Trump. I felt going into the debate that there was one thing that Biden needed to be able to do, and that was to demonstrate that he wasn't too old to continue on as president. And he failed to do that. And so when you come through that debate, and I, by the way, didn't think that Trump performed particularly well in that debate either, but he didn't have that kind of challenge in front of him that Biden had. So you had that debate, things began to change with that debate. And then you had on July 13th, in Butler County, Pennsylvania, the attempted assassination of Trump. And he picks up a little bit of a boost as a result of that. And then by July 7th to 21st, that had kind of died down. And you had a 48 to 45% Trump advantage in the polling nationwide. And he was leading in the swing states, almost all of them. July 15th to 18 was the Republican National Convention. On July 21st, Biden withdrew from the presidential race and almost immediately threw his support to Kamala Harris. I felt, by the way, at the time that she really was the only logical choice. If he had not thrown his support to Harris, there would have been a free-for-all among Democratic candidates leading up to the Democratic convention in the next month that would have really damaged any Democrat's prospects of being elected as president. So Biden withdraws, he endorses Harris. That, as I'll show you in a minute, was an important turning point in the campaign. Again, not by much, because remember, partisans are almost equally divided. And that means the polls aren't really going to show much of a shift in one direction or another, no matter what the event is. And a Biden withdrawal and a designation of Harris as his successor is a major event, right? But it had very little effect, although enough of an effect to, as you will see right here, to put Harris in the lead. Now, this particular figure shows two things. And one of them is what the average is among all the polls. Each dot there is a poll that was conducted. And what you're seeing there is the margin of Trump over Harris, or before that, over Biden. And you can see early on, and as I said before, Trump was in the lead, marginally so. And these are nationwide figures. But there are dots all over the place. Not so much distant from one another, but demonstrating that each survey, each poll can have somewhat different results. And we need to bear that in mind, and I'll talk about that later on for at least a little bit. So Harris is nominated on August 6th. The Democratic National Convention occurs on August 19th to the 22nd, but she had already been selected by the delegates who voted in an online poll on August the 6th. And by August 29th, Harris now is leading in the national polling average, and most of the swing states are showing a tie. And a tie within at least sampling error or the margin of error. September 10th is the Harris-Trump debate. Harris is widely credited as winning that debate, even grudgingly by many Republicans. But nonetheless, it doesn't change things all that much. The figure there is, you can see the blue line, which is the average for the Democratic candidate versus the Republican candidate. The blue line begins to go below the 50-50 figure, and Harris is in the lead. I think since then, I don't have more recent figures, since then that national lead has narrowed a little bit. But again, these are subject to the margin of error. And it's about half of the swing states that show, again within the margin of error, that they will go for Trump, and the other half will go for Kamala Harris. So again, a very, very tight contest. And those data, by the way, come from the Washington Post that did my work for me in terms of pulling together the various polling estimates. Okay, our focus tends to be on the presidential contest, right? But there are other contests on the ballot. And in fact, several thousand of them around the country in the states. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the down ballot because that matters as well. For the US Senate, there is a slight Democratic majority right now. If you add together the 48 Democrats and the 3 independents who vote with the Democrats to organize the Senate. There are 33 of the seats up. These are 2-year terms. And so about a third of the seats are up for election every 2 years. 33 6-year seats, and there are 2 seats to fill out the terms of members of the Senate in California, Dianne Feinstein, and in Nebraska, Ben Sass, I think his name is. That's an interesting story, by the way. He had resigned his Senate seat to become the president of the University of Florida, and then decided after, I think it was 18 months, maybe even less than that, that he no longer could continue in that position. Not because their football team was not doing well, although, that might be a factor there, but because I think his wife was having serious medical problems and he simply wanted to be able to devote his attention to her and to her condition. So those are open seats to be filled. Only 5 of them really are competitive. And those are 5 that are held by Democrats. So the Democrats really run the risk, and it's a grave risk, of losing their control of the Senate. One of them is already lost. It's not a competitive seat. That's Joe Manchin's seat in West Virginia. A Democrat, some would say a Democrat in name only, but Manchin decided not to run for re-election. That seat will be won by a Republican. And so that narrows the margin that the Democrats have in the Senate. In Arizona, we have an open seat. In Maryland, there's an open seat. The polls are showing in both of those states that the Democrat is considerably in the lead there. We'll see. That's why they have elections, is to determine who the winner is. And then there are 3 other states. Montana, John Tester's seat, the polls are showing that he's going to lose that seat. But again, it's early. Ohio is another one, Sherrod Brown. The polls are showing that he has a bit of an edge in Ohio, but it's not a lot of an edge. And we'll see what happens there. You've seen the ads, and so you will understand what the pressures are in that campaign. And then there's Nevada, and I think the polls are showing there that the Democrat, Rosen, is a bit ahead of the Republican there. But the Democrats need to win all of those seats to be able to hold their majority in the Senate. And they probably are not going to be able to do that. In the US House, all of the seats are up for election this year, 435 of them. These are 2-year terms. Currently, there are 213 Democrats and 218 Republicans in the House, a very, very narrow Republican majority. But it's enough because in the House of Representatives, party really matters. And if the Republicans are basically unified, they are going to be able to carry the day on anything they want to do. Now, they're not unified on everything, as you probably have read. On the other hand, the Democrats really don't have much chance to enact any of their policy perspectives. Of these seats, 24 of them are toss-up seats, competitive seats. 24 out of 435, about 5% of the seats, right? That's amazing, actually, that there are so many safe seats across the country. 11 of them are held by Democrats right now. 13 of them are held by Republicans right now. House control is going to depend on what happens in those seats. And I've been following them pretty closely. There are some very competitive seats in New York State where Republicans won, particularly on Long Island, in districts that they had not really held before. And it looks like the Democrats are going to take most of those seats back. There also are a bunch of competitive seats in California. And it's the same story. Republicans had won in 2022 seats the Democrats had typically held before. It looks like those seats are going to go to the Democrats. So I think the Democrats have a pretty good chance of securing a majority in the House of Representatives. But again, we will see. And if you happen to live in one of those districts, you will be so tired of seeing ads about one candidate or another, candidates you probably never even heard of, to tell you the truth, although you will have heard of them by the time the election is, or the election campaign is over with. And we're talking about millions and millions of dollars that are being invested in these races. The TV stations that control those markets are elated by this. Voters probably are so sick and tired of seeing the ads that they don't want to see anymore. By the way, there are 9 states that are so heavily gerrymandered, Ohio is one of them, that they almost guarantee a result that is highly favorable to the party that had conducted the gerrymander. In the case of Ohio, the Republicans, and in fact, in most states, gerrymandered in favor of the Republican Party. And that has very much helped the House Republicans in terms of getting members of the House of Representatives. Okay, let me now turn to the down ballot federal contests for governor, for state legislature, and so forth. And I want to talk just very briefly about them. Governors typically are not elected in presidential years, and that's because governors don't really want to run when the president is on the ballot because they have less control over the outcome there. It's going to be dominated by the favorability of the presidential candidate. Right now, there are 27 Republican governors, 23 Democratic governors. On the ballot this year are 11 governors, 8 of whom are Republicans, 3 of whom are Democrats. There's only among them one toss-up governor's mansion, and that's in New Hampshire. My friend in Boston, who follows New Hampshire politics, has told me that that's going to be won by the Republican. So that'll go in a Republican direction, which is where it's been before. Safe seats, number 8 among these. This is where the gubernatorial candidate of the incumbent party really has no effective challenge. 2 of them are incumbent Republicans. One is a Democratic open seat. The other 5 are Republican open seats, and they probably will go in that direction. So when the dust settles, there will be about as many Republican governors as we have today. Not much of a change there. In the state legislatures, there are 7,400 seats that are being contested this year.
Wow.
One state, Nebraska, has a unicameral legislature, one body. All the others have 2 bodies. Some of them, I think New Hampshire has over 400 members of the legislature. So there are a lot of them on the ballot this year. 78% of them will be contested in 2024. Some of the others, Senate seats, upper chamber seats, are every 4-year seats. So half of them will be contested. I have some figures there that I'm not going to talk much about, but there were some of these members of the state legislatures who were defeated in primaries, 16 of them Republicans, by the way. I think almost all of them were were opposed by Trump. He had endorsed somebody else in that particular primary and was successful there in getting that candidate selected by the party, which means they're going to be anointed in the general election. In 2022, just to cite figures that I have in hand, 24% of the state legislative seats were open. That means no incumbent running. 41% of them were safe seats, largely as the effect of gerrymandering in a lot of states. And then 27% were seats held by incumbents, but they were incumbents who were running in contested primaries. And there's been a lot of contestation of primaries on both sides of the aisle. Republicans, mainly Republicans who are kind of, old establishment, mainstream Republicans, being contested or opposed by people who are getting a Trump endorsement. And that endorsement is magic in many cases, certainly in the primaries. On the Democratic side, there have been a number of opponents who have risen in the primaries who were more or less progressive Democrats opposing a mainstream Democrat. Most of them have lost. The Democrats have been very good at kind of protecting their incumbents and protecting their incumbents from challenges from in this case, from the left. There also are what are called trifectas. Now, trifectas are important. They are situations where both houses of the legislature, or in the case of Nebraska, the one house, are controlled by the same party as the governor. That means the party that is in control can do pretty much what it wants to do. And there are a total of 23 trifectas that have Republican control, 17 trifectas that have Democratic control, 10 that are divided. The divided ones, by the way, are important because if you ever get a break from gerrymandering, you get it in those situations where they have to basically make a deal between one house of the legislature or the governor to be able to redistrict in such a way that both parties are more or less accepting of. But only 10 out of 50 states are in that particular situation. Finally, there are a whole bunch of ballot measures that are up in a variety of states. Most of them are abortion-focused measures, pro-choice versus pro-life. 10 of them are promoting abortion rights. One of them, Nebraska, is promoting further restrictions on abortion. Now, Nebraska is an interesting case because they have two abortion-related amendments on the ballot. One that is pro-abortion rights, pro-choice. The other one that is opposed to abortion rights, pro-life. And the one that gets the most votes will be the one that effectively amends the Constitution. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in Nebraska there. But a lot of abortion amendments on the ballot. The history here has been that I think I'm right in saying that every time there was an abortion amendment, a right to abortion amendment on the ballot, it has passed, including Ohio. And so a lot of money is being pumped in to these campaigns on both sides of the aisle. And as I said, it'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of them. Need to keep an eye on time here. I wanted to talk about Ohio in a little bit of detail. We have a very competitive race for the U.S. Senate. And you can see this from the polls, and the polls that are focused, of course, on Brown and on Moreno. More money has been spent in Ohio on the Senate campaign than any other Senate campaign in the country. And we're talking about the figure I saw the other day, but it wasn't confirmed. And I, by the way, don't pay much attention to these figures until I find detail on them, mostly federal reports on them that have to be filed by the candidates. But it looks like over $1 billion is going to be spent on these Senate campaigns. My wife has said to me, why don't they just invest that money in social services? And I'll have to admit, that's not a bad idea, actually, but they're not going to do that. Moreno has the Trump endorsement. And in fact, if you look at his ads, I think it's almost half of them talk almost solely about the Trump endorsement. That's what he has going for him. And of course, Trump has won Ohio by 8% in both the 2020 and the 2016 elections. The polls in Ohio are showing him up not by the 8% that he had in those two elections, but by a still formidable 6%. So it appears that Trump is indeed going to win Ohio, which is why you're not going to see any presidential ads from either Trump or from the Democratic candidate Kamala Harris. The U.S. House races are kind of interesting to follow. There are 3 competitive districts in Ohio. designed that way by the map makers when they were doing the map making back in early 2021, actually. One of them is the first district in Cincinnati, held by a Democrat. The second one is the 9th district in right along Lake Erie from Toledo, I think, all the way towards Cleveland, not getting there all the way. That's Marcy Kapter's district. She's the incumbent there. And then Amelia Sykes is the representative in the 13th district, running against Kevin Coughlin, who used to be in the Ohio legislature, I think the Senate, if I remember right. Those are rated as toss-up races. The first district race is one that I think is going to be won by the Democrat. And the reason I think that is that the Republicans have invested no national money in that campaign. They've kind of written it off. They're choosing to spend their money on other campaigns. In Ohio, by the way, we have, as I mentioned before, a highly gerrymandered state legislature as well as congressional delegation. 53 to 54% of Ohioans vote Republican. If you look at all the statewide races and kind of average them out. The Republicans, on the other hand, control 67% of the congressional districts. They control 68% of the Ohio House districts. They control 79% of the Ohio Senate districts. Those margins of control are important because in both the Ohio State House and State Senate, those constitute supermajorities. It means they can do almost anything they want to do. And that probably is not going to change much in the 2024 contest. I think the Senate is likely to become more conservative over time. I think there are only 7 Democrats in the Senate right now, state Senate. It appears that 1 or 2 of them may actually lose election. So they're going to whittle that figure down to probably 5 or 6. I think there may be some Democratic gains in the Ohio House of Representatives, but we'll see. Again, that's why they have elections. For the state House, by the way, 15 seats are uncontested, means there is no opponent for the person who is running with the nod of a particular party. 62% beyond them are safe seats. Those are seats that the opposition party is not going to be able to win. 22 of those seats are competitive. As I said before, 10 of them tend to be pro-democratic. For the state Senate, there is one uncontested seat, 7 safe seats, 8 competitive seats, but probably not all that competitive. There are 2 open seats, by the way, in Franklin County. One of them is in southwest Columbus. The other one is in the western suburbs of the Columbus metropolitan area. Those will be important seats in terms of the future of the Ohio legislature and which party is going to be able to secure better representation there. There are also, as you know, and you're probably seeing ads for this already, there's a redistricting reform ballot initiative to establish an independent commission rather than elected officials. The title is Citizens, Not Politicians. The ballot language, if you read it, doesn't really, in my judgment, reflect what that is all about. What it basically does is it requires this commission, if it is indeed supported by a majority and the Constitution is amended, it requires the commission to compromise between Democrats and Republicans with independent votes as well. They are not going to be engaged in a gerrymander, as the ballot language suggests. That was, I think, a cheap shot, actually, and an unfortunate cheap shot because it detracts from the real meaning of that amendment. There also are some major state issues that you will see talked about in the campaigns, both for Congress as well as for the state legislature. I should, by the way, add a footnote here, and that is that most people don't know much about state legislative candidates. They're almost invisible to most of the electorate. And so people tend to vote party in those kinds of circumstances. Most of these state legislative candidates don't have the money to be able to run ads. And in fact, the markets for these ads are strange markets. You don't want to spend money on Columbus television only to hit the 10% of that market who lie outside of the city of Columbus and its major metropolitan suburbs. So these are going to be candidates that are basically advantaged by their party. And we will see that going on. But the issues that are going to be talked about certainly are abortion, certainly are redistricting reform. And then there's kind of a sleeper issue that I keep thinking is going to emerge, but it hasn't yet. And that has to do with the first energy corruption scandal. And in the past, I thought this was a gift to the Democrats and that they should have used it in their campaigns. The reason they didn't was that a number of Democrats had supported Larry Householder, who was the mastermind behind the corruption scandal, who's now in prison, by the way. And so they had received his financing to run for their reelection or their election. It was kind of hard for them to make the case that somebody ought to vote to, to oust the party that was most tied to the corruption. So this may emerge as an issue. It's going to be hard for the Democrats to make much of this issue because they're not going to have the money for advertising. And we'll just have to see how that is going forward. And then turnout will matter. 74% of the registered voters in Ohio voted in the 2020 election. That, by the way, is of registered voters. There are probably 20% of Ohioans who aren't registered to vote, but who are eligible to vote, but they're not added in to that figure. American turnout figures, by the way, are pretty dismal compared to turnout figures in most of the Democratic world. The question is going to be enthusiasm. What is it that mobilizes voters to get them to go to the polls to support their party? And once Harris was selected as the Democratic nominee, you saw this huge boost in enthusiasm. And it may well be that that will carry over into the election itself. Okay, I think I'm getting close probably to the end. So I'm going to skip over this particular. Well, I was skipping over a lot of those. I'm going to skip over this. And the point that I was making, by the way, in the slide that I just skipped over, is that how do we know what's going on in an election campaign? We know it in two ways. One, through the trial heat polls that are conducted, that again are subject to this margin of error that I talked about, but there are a lot of them. And then the second one is from campaign spending. But campaign spending figures are very hard to get a handle on, because the only ones that are reported officially are contributions to the candidate campaigns. And that is a small percentage of the money that is spent to re-elect or elect candidates. Most of the money is spent by super PACs that don't have to report until after the election, and by 503c4s, which are dark money groups that basically don't have to identify who the donors are. And so there are a lot of donors who would prefer to have their money flow through these 503c4s, and that way they don't have to be embarrassed by having to support one candidate or another. Well, I'm going to skip over and go to the conclusion here. And I can talk about polling later if you want me to. But by way of conclusion, the national contests for president, for the House and the Senate will be close. Don't go to bed one night thinking that it's all wrapped up, only to find out the next night that the polls have shifted just a little bit to put the candidates you favor on the more negative side. One question that one should ask is how candidate health and legal troubles may affect the presidential race. Health already, of course, affected the Biden candidacy. Legal troubles may affect the Trump candidacy. We will see. I think the Democrats will try to make hay with them. Another question is how might the contest for president affect the down ballot races, the so-called coattails? What we know in recent years, by the way, is that coattails have dwindled over time. Voters are very much inclined to vote their party up and down the ticket. But there's been some change in that in recent years, particularly from the never-Trumpers who are Republicans. How pro-Republican Ohio results are likely to be, I put the questions there. I won't go into them in much detail, except that the really interesting contest is going to be for the Speaker of the House of Representatives here in Ohio. And it's going to be between Jason Stevens, the current Speaker of the House, and Matt Huffman, the current Majority Leader of the Senate, who is term limited, is running for the House. He has no opposition in the general election. He wants to be Speaker of the House of Representatives. We will see what happens there. I think that will be the major drama in the Ohio House races. Will the Independent Redistricting Commission amendment win a majority? I tend to think that it will, but of course that's in doubt, and there's going to be heavy spending, particularly on the Republican and the negative side there. And then the question is, will it matter? Will the Ohio legislature, in one way or another, try to disable that constitutional amendment? One way they could do it is by refusing to provide any funds for the commission. Now, the amendment does have a stipulation for an appropriation to fund commission members, but the legislature doesn't have to do that, and it would be litigated in the courts, and we'll see what happens. And then what's going to happen in 2026? Well, you're already seeing candidates beginning to jostle for the gubernatorial nomination, particularly on the Republican side. There are a whole bunch of term-limited Republican statewide officials who want to be governor. LaRose is one of them. There are others there. We'll see what happens over time. I think LaRose is not going to be the nominee, but anything could happen. Well, let me stop at that point and take questions. I'm not sure I can provide answers, but I'd be glad to hear your questions.
Thank you, Paul. That was very interesting. So we have time for questions. Jackie, will you get a microphone and back out to people? And I have one up front. Remember, we have a Zoom audience, so please ask your questions into a microphone. We'll try and come to you, and we'll start up here.
Well, Paul, a group that you really haven't spoken about are those individuals who are truly independent, who vote split tickets. And especially in our state of Ohio, where we have a very centrist Republican, I'm sure that—
As governor, you mean?
As our governor,
yeah.
Exactly. Could you make some comment about the centrist voters?
Okay, first, there are very few of them. As you saw from the data I presented early on, most Americans are either Democrats or Republicans. They may, in answer to the question about partisanship, they may say, well, I'm an independent. And then they are basically asked by the interviewer, well, do you lean towards one party or the other? Almost all of them lean. And in fact, the leaners tend to be more loyal for that party, the party they lean to, than weak partisans are, which is kind of interesting. In Ohio, if you are not someone who votes in the primaries, you are registered as unaffiliated. They are not necessarily independents. They could be, some of them could be. But I think there are really these days, in this era of polarization and deep-seated partisanship, there really are very few true independents, particularly as the two parties at the elite level, their candidates, are more polarized themselves. The middle, the Mike DeWines are rare. And in fact, he has been, I think, quite uncomfortable in that kind of position, as the legislature has defied him over and over and over again on issues that he's cared about. So there are some independents, and in a very close election, they could matter, just as these third-party and independent candidate supporters could matter. But the election has to be pretty close for them to be able to matter much.
Thank you. I have a question about the polarization slide you showed in the beginning over time with the two parties. And there was you pointed out a blip upward in the Republican polarization in the early 70s, basically. And Nixon was president, Watergate happened, and major Vietnam protests were occurring. What's your theory as to why there was that blip and then came back down? Is it related to those events, you think?
Well, I think it depends very much on the candidates. And one of them, certainly in 2020, 2016, and now in 2024, is a polarizer. And that is Donald Trump, much more so than Kamala Harris or even Joe Biden was. And so you see that effect, certainly, and it's a pretty powerful effect. But it goes beyond that. People are very much inclined to support their tribe. These are really identities that people feel very, very strongly. And you may see this in your friendship network. You may see people who support different parties and who get their backs up when they are challenged, either fairly or unfairly. And we're just in an era of that kind. Again, my example that I like to use is Mozambique, where there had been this civil war where, according to figures I saw, 500,000 people were either killed or injured in some way or another. And then they held an election a few years later, and there was deep polarization because the election was a tribal battle in Mozambique. The only other country that resembles the United States was Brazil in its most recent presidential election. Again, very sharp polarization there, very much along the lines of the American polarization, by the way, along religious lines and others. So there are a variety of factors that enter in to why polarization either rises or falls or is at the level that it's at. But I think it's primarily who the candidates are, because we tend to fixate on the candidates at the top of the ticket and think most about them.
We clearly have an infractionated style of voting in this country, some by mail, some in person, you know, there's a variety of ways. We have the technology, and it's basically bulletproof, that we could vote from our phones. When do you see in the next X number of years that possibly happening?
Well, some states already have, sorry to talk too much into this, some states already have mail voting only. Oregon is one of them. I think it's not a far cry to have them move to being able to vote from the phone. One worries about hacking. One worries about manipulation there. Now, any of these votes can be manipulated. I'm reminded of my mother, who was in a nursing home, and she got her absentee ballot there. She'd always voted. And so I showed up at the nursing home to kind of walk her through that ballot. She said, "Oh, we've already voted." They assembled us in the dining room and we voted. And I thought, that's probably not a good thing. So I think until we work our way through ways to validate the vote or get beyond a candidate who attacks any kind of voting. And by the way, voting in Ohio and elsewhere is virtually error-free. Every once in a while, you'll find an example of somebody who has cheated in one way or another, but it's very, very few. Again, I'm reminded of my neighbor when I lived in Florida, who came up to me at a block party and said, "I vote in 2 states." And I said, "Oh, that would be illegal." He said, "Yeah, I have property in Ohio." He was from Columbus, actually. "And I own a house here in Florida. And so I vote in both states." I did not turn him in, although I was really tempted to. I should have asked him how he was going to vote, and then I would have
So
decided
we
whether to
can
turn
go
him in.
to a maximum of 5:15. I know there's lots of questions. Please keep your questions short, quick, to the point. We'll try and get as many in as we can.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to issue 1, which was penultimate item on your list on the last slide. And you said, will it work?
Mm.
I voted for the last 2 versions of that, and the answer is it didn't work. So what is the argument that this is really going to be different? That it has a reasonable chance to work?
Okay, what is different about the current issue 1? I think 2 things. One is that it sets up a commission. It is citizens, not politicians, although the members of the commission will be 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, none of whom are in the legislature, and 5 independents. And the problem in the past has been that when the legislature creates the districts, what do they think about first? They think about their own district, and then the districts that are favored in their majority, if they have a majority. And so that will get around that. And then there also are stipulations that they cannot basically design a redistricting scheme that favors one party over the other. The trick there is, how do you measure that? And is that something that could be challenged in the courts? And probably it could be. But I think the real key is the commission. And the commission, with its 5-5-5 membership, is going to be a commission that basically is going to try to compromise on redistricting. But we will see.
In your discussion of the tribal nature of our environment, is there any research that indicates what leads any deserters from a tribe to make a change? Are there any attributes of those kinds of citizens that jump or change for a particular reason?
And we will know more about defections from the tribe after we do our 2024 survey, or Michigan does its American National Election Study survey. But you sort of see what's going on at the elite level, the leadership level. There are some Republicans who are never Trump Republicans, or who have now, and in fact recently, said they will endorse Kamala Harris and vote for her. Many of them do not want to give up their party. I think they are hoping that their party will return to what they would regard as normalcy once Trump is out of the way. I think that he won't be out of the way even if he loses, but they are nonetheless, I think, loyal enough to their party that they don't want to leave it, completely. Many of them were born and raised as Republicans and are not going to change that. Many of them are very conservative in terms of their ideological positioning, and are lamenting that the Republican Party doesn't look as conservative as it once did, but are hoping that they will return to that. What happens at the level of the voters, we'll see. I don't know the answer to that yet.
Back here.
Yes, so this Jason Stevens contested speakership of the House issue, where the more centrist candidate wins by votes from the opposition party. Has that dynamic happened in any other states that you know of?
Well, let me address the Ohio situation first, and then I'll come back to the other states, which I know much less about. But in Ohio, there were the 22, I guess it is, blue Republicans who voted to select Jason Stevens over the person, Derek Merrin, who's now running for Congress in the 9th District, over Derek Merrin. And they joined with almost all Democrats. And so Jason Stevens was elected with Democratic votes by and large. But because the Republican majority is so large, he needed a bunch of Republican votes as well. Well, of those candidates, I believe the number is 17 ran for reelection in 2024. In almost every case, Matt Huffman found a candidate who could oppose them in the primaries. And 6 of those candidates won, but 11 did not win. And so the real question going forward is going to be, will those 11 hang tough and continue to vote for Jason Stevens? Or is there a way that Matt Hoffman may be able to pull them in his direction? What I'm told, by the way, by people who know much more about the legislature than I do, is that there are a lot of House Republicans who resent Matt Hoffman coming from the Senate into the House of Representatives and running for Speaker even before he has his feet wet there. Now, we will see. He is a very powerful and convincing, persuasive political figure. And Jason Stevens is probably not. So we'll see what happens there. It'll be interesting to look at it.
And we have one here.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation, Paul, and thank me very much to your wife for her wise question and observation. I want to ask you, if you were meeting with a group of very thoughtful and well-informed people, say from a third world country, and trying to make a case for democracy as a government institution at this time, how would you do it?
Well, I think it would be a real challenge because what foreigners see, foreigners who are very committed to democracy and are in countries that are democratic themselves, what they see is the American electoral process unraveling. All kinds of challenges to the vote, to who votes, to how the votes are counted, and then a refusal of a losing candidate to concede the election and turn over the presidency to the opponent. I'm in a research group, this Comparative National Election Project group, that always admired the United States as being a really ideal form of democracy. I think they exaggerated the extent we were a democracy, but that's another issue. They're not there now. They're very much questioning where we are going to be going forward. And of course, the result of the 2024 election is going to materially affect that as well. I hear from all of my colleagues in this project saying, what's going to happen in the United States? And the truth is, I don't know what's going to happen.
We have 3 minutes left.
Real quick question, so it deserves a real quick answer. Will there ever be an amendment to the Constitution of the United States to abolish our present college electoral?
Yeah, I often get that question, and I'm not a big fan of the Electoral College for a couple of reasons. One is I don't really believe that the states ought to be able to award all their electors, even if a candidate has not won a majority of the vote in that state. And the states could change that. And some of them have. Nebraska now, as you know, has this one congressional district that is separate from the rest of the state. So they could change that. Will there be a constitutional amendment to do away with the Electoral College? I'm a realist. And even if I would like to see that, I don't see that happening because amending the Constitution is very difficult, particularly if that amendment would have winners and losers in terms of the kind of clout a state would have in the Electoral College itself.
Time for one more. All right, our past leader here gets it.
Paul, thank you very much. I've heard talk that college-age students could make a big difference in this election, and we are in a college campus. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think there are extensive mobilization efforts on college campuses, including Ohio State's. And we have some majors in political science who are very active in trying to make sure that people turn out to vote. And I think in their case, turn out to vote the right way, though they may be careful about how they ask that question. College students in the past have been pretty important in close elections, mainly because they are in a location that is easily mobilizable. What I'm seeing in the polls right now is that 18 to 29-year-olds, and those are, of course, people who are in college, and some, many not, most not, in fact, favor Trump more than they favor Harris. Now, that could change over time, but it's still a margin that I was kind of surprised to see, to tell you the truth, because in 2020, people in that age group were much more favorable towards Joe Biden than they were towards Donald Trump. So I think there will be efforts to try to mobilize college students. Young people, that 18 to 29 age group, by the way, vote at the lowest rate of any age group in the population, and the difference is astounding, actually. Most of them, as my grandchildren tell me, have better things to do than to vote in an election. And they may be right, actually. I don't think that, but I'm not going to tell them that. Actually, I do tell them that.
So I suspect Dr. Beck may be able to stay a little longer to answer some questions in person. Thank you all for your great questions, a great audience, and thank you so much for your time and insights.
Thank you very much.